Hello, ghouls and gals, and welcome back to my most wretched den. Today's video is a bit of a unicorn among my content. I rarely, if ever, return to ideas like this, but WolfoX32 has been very adamant about seeing this alternative Warhammer reality come back to this channel, and who am I to deny a loyal ghoul? If you've not seen part 1 of this alternate reality, where we look at how Vlad comes to the throne, I think you should watch it because I put time and effort into it, but I also think that we can do a little summary here for those not quite clued in. Essentially, Vlad wins the throne in the centuries before Karl Franz's time, as he planned to do so ages ago. His reign is met with a fairly mixed reaction, but as Vlad is a very powerful vampire, he manages to get himself a very strong centre of power in Altdorf. Considering the ambitious nature of vampires though, especially Vlad's fellow family members, he does find the odd bit of opposition coming from inside his house. Vlad tames Conrad as much as he can, batters Manfred's bald ass, eliminating him and solidifying his position on the throne of the Empire. What we didn't cover in that video was, well, now that I think about it, quite a lot actually. We didn't delve into Vlad's foreign policy as a main bit of contention, and we didn't really discuss what role Isabella would play in this new empire. I also think it downplayed how easily Vlad would win over or defeat the cult of Sigmar, and wouldn't mind maybe going back on that section. In any case, let's get started with how Daddy Vladdy does in power now he has to speak to the dwarves, elves, and other races of the old world. While I think Vlad would have a grand old time if the Empire was an isolated kingdom, the fact is that it sits pretty much slap bang in the middle of most of the Order Tide. Sure, with promises of power and a large enough army to keep the old Sigmar resistance at bay, Vlad can have a pretty strong empire to call his own. It won't be perfect, not like under some of the greater emperors, such as our boy Karl Franz, but so long as he doesn't throw away his charm and the good rulership he showed in Sylvania, I think he's going to keep the Empire without much worry from within. Besides the Sigmar loyalists, of course, but there are a couple of ways he can deal with them, as we'll get to. As I said though, we're talking dwarves, elves and other factions here, and foreign policy arguably poses Vlad's greatest challenge yet. There are races in the old world that simply won't accept a vampire emperor, no matter how many biscuits he offers them with a warm, toothy grin. The dwarves, for example, absolutely hate the undead. Also, they were strong allies with the men of the Empire, meaning not only will any insurgents in Vlad's empire have friends in the dwarves, but that the dwarves are unlikely to let Vlad rule without the odd challenge here and there. Lucky for Vlad, dwarves rarely, if ever, step outside of their homes, especially for the sake of another race. They are not the most numerous of folks, and if there's one thing Vlad will have in taking over the Empire, it's numbers. Vast undead hordes, now given greater numbers by the millions of additional bodies available in the Empire, Vlad not only has his skeletons and zombies ready to defend the Empire, but troops loyal to him too. He probably wouldn't want to mix the living and undead armies too much, as this could lead to seriously low morale, but if he lets his skeleton legions act as a buffer before the swordsmen, riflemen and knights of the Empire are brought to the fray, then I think he's in quite a defensible position. So I think even if the dwarves aren't ever going to be mates with Vlad, he could still live in relative peace with them so long as he doesn't go kicking in their front door. Sucks to be a dwarf living in the Empire, I suppose. The High Elves would offer similar levels of friendliness, as in none. Elves see vampirism as another sign that humans are an inferior race, so if someone afflicted with the Red Thirst was suddenly sitting at the pinnacle of human society, then the likelihood of the Elven kingdoms dealing with him drastically drops. The numbers don't lie, and they spell doom for Vlad if he tries to make friends with the High Elves. The Wood Elves are just as likely to scorn the curse of death and decay heading their way, although again with both the High and Wood Elves, they're quite isolated. Sure, the Call of Kurnos might bring Orion some wild riders down on Vlad's head every so often, but I can't see the full force of Ulthuan bearing down upon him, nor will the entire forest of Athel-Loren rise against him, unless there was some Order-Tide scheme to put a human back on the throne of the Empire, which I don't expect there would be, because most of the other races and factions I don't think would care too much. Then Vlad gets to dodge invasion from both the elves and the dwarves. There is one elf faction I've not spoken about, mostly because I think it's one of the only foreign powers Vlad has a chance of becoming friendly with. The Dark Elves are not overly fond of vampires, and the pain-loving freaks filling their society might be a bit bored by creatures that feel very little at all, but I think where the two of them can find common ground is in their sheer ambition. Sure, this might lead to both the Dark Elves and Undead thinking they should rule the world, but while they've got more enemies than friends, I can see an uneasy alliance being forged between them. Mostly, this would also need Vlad to find some contact within the Vampire Coast, as otherwise I think he'd struggle to make any sort of meaningful relationship with Nagorond. Should he bring the coast to his forces though, then he could soon have a massive naval presence alongside the Black Arcs of the Dark Elves. If we look at other human factions, we see a bit of a mixed bag, but mostly it'll sway against Vlad. He might be able to broker a non-aggression agreement with Kislev, as the Ice Country has enough problems to worry about without fending off undead to the south, but Bretonnia would be a big issue for Vlad to deal with. These guys loathe the undead, and while they're not always the tightest bros with the Imperials, they're more than happy to venture into far-off lands in order to complete a quest. With the amount of refugees and migrants likely leaving the Empire in the hopes of a more normal life in Bretonnia too, you can imagine massive armies of whoever is willing to fight heading into the east of the Empire with a fairly quick path towards Altdorf, willing to send Vlad packing back to Sylvania. This, at least, will be the cause of Vlad's biggest conflicts in the first years of his reign, I reckon. Of course, depending on who wins the conflicts, the geography of the Empire's territory could change, but either way, I think Bretonnia would find a new target for its crusading soon enough. Again, they might have had somewhat of an alliance with the Old Empire, but at the end of the day, most of the factions in the Old World are as isolationist as they can be when it comes to grand political matters. Only a few times has the Order properly come together, and even then it took time and a threat that was planning on destroying the world, not just giving it new leadership. So again, this is where we're likely to see things like the Cult of Sigmar or the leftovers of that faction establish themselves in somewhere like Bretonnia and gain somewhat of a following, I would argue, but not necessarily one massive enough to challenge Vlad's huge new armies of undead and those loyal to him. A lot of this could be avoided if Vlad, say, used a dummy emperor as his proxy, but I think that defeats the point of Vlad von Carstein becoming emperor. In any case, we've not yet talked about the easternmost human faction in the game, Cathay. As Vlad is a well-travelled man, not only do I think he'd be aware of Cathay, I think he'd seek out potential deals with the Dragon Lords in the hopes of boosting his economy through trade. With the distance between the Empire and Cathay, the Eastern Empire probably won't really notice that there's a constant grey cloud hanging over the Westerners, and that their people are a lot paler. With luxury goods coming from Cathay, I think that Vlad could make the Empire a richer state, at least in key places. This again would win him some bonus points with his domestic policy, as even if he is a vampire, so long as that's something people can ignore, then they're happy to judge him as they would any other emperor, and big money is a big way for people to ignore someone being a vampire. I don't think Vlad would have any strong relations with the Tomb Kings, just to wrap up the last few factions we've not spoke about. Also, he's not going to be speaking to the Lizard Men, no one will. There's a great distance between Khemri and Altdorf, and outside of both factions being undead, they have little in common. Perhaps a few Tomb Kings could go and try and join Vlad's budding empire for a change of scenery, but I doubt they'll be thick as thieves. The Skaven, Beastmen and Orcs will be just as annoying for Vlad to deal with as they were for any other emperor, although at least for Vlad, each invading army will add to his strength when cut down. Sure, he'll need a lot of necromancers to maintain all this, but we'd imagine there will be plenty of them, with him allowing necromancy to be studied at the colleges in Altdorf. The only thing we've not really spoken about, alongside Isabella, which we'll get to, is whether Vlad could withstand a Chaos invasion. I'm not just talking about the odd Norscan raid here, as in the last video I said his undead fortress of an empire is actually rather suited to fend off a simple invasion. I mean, could Vlad withstand an end times level event? If Archaon bursts through Kislev and challenges Daddy Vladdy, could the sharp-toothed geezer pull off a victory? Cover your ears, Vlad fans, for I think the answer is probably not. Don't get me wrong, Vlad will put up a valiant fight, but even if Nagash just doesn't come back and take control of him, which is unlikely to be fair considering Vlad would have dealt with Manfred as per the last video, then it's incredibly tricky for Vlad to hold the Empire on his own, because he almost definitely would be alone. Remember that the only team-ups we really got during the end times happened after the dwarves had been all but annihilated and the Empire was a crumbling ruin. Yes, the Bretonnians showed up at the Siege of Altdorf, but only because Karl Franz had been picked as someone too important to die by the Lady. Sure, King Lewin might get a visit from the Lady telling him that he needs to go and fight for Vlad's life, but is he really going to lay it all down battling Kugath Plaguefather if it's not Karl Franz leading the Empire? The saving grace for Vlad in all of this, as is the case in all of his life, could be Isabella. Hello, Izzy darling. Sorry to have kept you waiting so long. Isabella is on the other side of Vlad's coin, really. They are both cunning and quick-witted, but because Isabella is a much younger and more beautiful person than Vlad, I think she serves as the perfect face to his rule. To keep the peasantry calm, the Empress makes herself the most visible person among the royal family. Her form may be ageless, her skin frosty, but Isabella may be able to keep the fears of vampires taking over at bay. She's not really a softer touch than Vlad. If anything, she's probably more likely to say they should just rule the Empire like they ruled all of Sylvania, but she has a very important role to play as perhaps the only person in the world that Vlad can truly trust. Conrad is a fine warrior but no advisor, and the other vampires are about as loyal as they are living. Isabella, therefore, I guess becomes a bit like the Empire's version of Melania. On the surface, that's the case at least. I think if you were at the court of these two, you'd see Vlad as the good cop and Isabella as the bad. From what lore we have on her, we know that she can be a very cruel person when she wishes, and doesn't care for anything that doesn't help her personally. However, I still think even with Isabella at his side, that Vlad isn't strong enough to hold the Empire alone against the Chaos Gods. When we think about Vlad as a good emperor, we often think that because he's a harsh but fair statesman, and that he'll do really well on the throne. And yes, because of these facts, it is likely that he'd have a strong domestic policy and could rule the Empire well enough. However, the Empire's greatest strength within the Warhammer world is not the might of its 1 or 2 citizens, but the unified whole it becomes when under great threat. It can also summon even the most reluctant of allies when the need is great enough, if those allies see the pure intentions of humanity trying to defend itself against destruction. Vlad von Carstein could make pleas, even convince some factions to aid him, but just as we saw with the selfishness of Nagash's Mortarks in the end times, I believe that the ambitious nature of an undead empire would make it all too easily to crack against chaos undivided. That's probably not the ending you Vlad stands were hoping for, but if he doesn't lose his empire to a grand invasion, then Vlad almost definitely ends up having to retreat back into Sylvania due to the rise of Sigmar's faithful again, perhaps emboldened by the likes of the dwarves, elves, Bretonnians, or a mixture of them all. At least in his rise and fall he'd have some good times, and some people may even miss the days when the sun rarely came out and they were ruled by an ageless pale dude with a strange accent. What do you think? Could Vlad hold out against all these foreign haters? Does he have it in him to make death rule the world? Let me know, and thanks as always for watching. I'll see you next time, ghouls and girls.